This visit by President Trump could not be more different than his previous interactions with China.
Lifting the export control by the U.S. side is the beginning.
This is sort of the last moment in which the U.S. could try to reestablish that leverage and continue to have some degree of market share before losing it entirely.
China has significant experience or capability of building electrical output. That's something that's certainly needed if it's for the U.S. to maintain strong leadership positions in the areas.
That does not mean that there are not corrections, consolidations in the short term, but the trend is pretty clear.
If even the U.S. has to come to China and seek help, then why are you out there trying to take a very different approach?
The Chat Lounge. Chat Lounge.
Chat Lounge.
The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
He's back in Beijing. Does the visit signal the beginning of a tech thaw or merely a pause before tensions escalate further? China and the U.S. are reshaping the global tech order. Will the next decade bring managed competition on a fractured tech world? Welcome to the Chat Lounge. I'm Tuyun. Joining me to unpack the tech implications of U.S. President Donald Trump's visit to China, Andy Mok, a professor of Beijing Foreign Studies University, who's also a senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Josef Mahoney, a professor of politics and international relations at East China Normal University. And Dr. Haolan Wang, a research associate at the Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis. A warm welcome to you all, gentlemen. So let's first take a look at the latest developments that we've had from the American president's China visit. Nearly half of the delegation accompanying Trump this time consists of tech industry leaders. And by comparison, nearly half of the U.S. delegation visiting China back in 2017 came from the energy and chemical sectors. How do you interpret this shift in comparison? Andy, shall we begin with you?
Well, I think that this visit by President Trump could not be more different than his previous interactions with China. In fact, it not only seems like two completely different people, but I can't help but be reminded of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, in that if we think back, both he and his administration were not only critical of China, but critical in such a demeaning way. And here, it was almost effusive in his praise for President Xi, for the Chinese people, for China's economic success. So I think this is one part that we have to pay attention to. And then when we look at the CEOs that came, I think, again, this is recognition of just how important China is as a marketplace for these companies. So it's not just energy, but even finance. So a number of the CEOs were from Visa, BlackRock, et cetera. So I think this just shows you how central China is diplomatically as well as economically, despite the tariff war that President Trump has unleashed on the world and on China as well.
Right. Joseph, do you have a different interpretation of this shift or changes in the composition of the delegation?
Well, I wouldn't disagree with Andy, but I would add a couple of other perspectives. The first is, when he came in 2017, it really was a lot more about energy and chemicals. And those were more transactional relationships. By the way, there's still a lot of concerns related to the energy and chemical industries. But I think with tech, I think Trump understands that he needs these companies, he needs these CEOs to come with him and to engage in sort of a united front, but also he needs them to be sort of some sort of diplomatic face for him. So there's sort of a double problem here. The first problem is China is really finding breakout solutions to the tech blockade that the U.S. has imposed. And this has created a lot of anxiety among America's tech oligarchs who realize that they are at severe risk for being locked out of the Chinese market entirely. And so they really need to come over and be part of these discussions and sort of hope that there can be some sort of rulemaking or some sort of deal making that would allow them to continue to compete in the market. And so on the one hand, Trump needs them there so that they're not breaking ranks, that the whole policy isn't falling apart, but also to help construct possible solutions to move forward. So there could be some sort of deal making where they would be able to retain some market share. So that's what I see as sort of driving their concentration in his delegation.
Okay, right. Like you just mentioned, maybe quite some tech oligarchs, they're really worried. One of them is NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang. He was seen boarding Air Force One in Alaska at the last minute, but according to reports, he had previously not been included in the delegation. Then, Haolan, what signal does that send?
I think this is a very interesting question. Is that whether he was really invited in the beginning or after by President Trump? President Trump, after seeing reports on CNBC, that he said he wasn't invited and decided to invite him. So that was some story put out by American media. So we don't know if that's true or not, but it could be signaling that in the beginning maybe they were not going to discuss about certain tech export control issues, including the sale, particularly concerning NVIDIA, is the H200 chips to China. And then the decision to bring him, other than maybe desire to call CNBC one of his Trump's old foe fake news in the public and contradict their story, is potentially to achieve what NVIDIA really wants is to sell their chips and make that breakthrough and relax the American export controls. So we still don't know the results yet. I guess at the moment we don't have the full details about the achievement and deliverable had been achieved during this meeting, but a rumor on the streets is that the U.S. is going to allow a significant numbers of Chinese firms, including ByteDance, Tencent, and Alibaba, to get the hold of the H200 chips, which could be significant in terms of not only just tech industry, but also one question loomed large in Washington and Silicon Valley, particularly around the now emerging AI lobbying group, is the so-called AI race between the U.S. and China. So that could have massive implications.
Right, but some analysts actually look beyond H200. They see that as a possible signal that Beijing may be making progress in gaining access to high-performance chips, such as NVIDIA's Blackwell B200 GPU, which is obviously more advanced than H200. But so far, what we've heard is that the U.S. side has approved H200 chip sales to 10 Chinese firms, like you just mentioned, which may not be all that significant given, Washington already lifted export restrictions on the H200 back in December, right? So how do you assess this development? Did Jensen Huang, make all that effort for nothing?
I wouldn't say it's nothing. I think lifting the export control by the U.S. side is the beginning, right? Committing, also from China's perspective, the government in China has to approve these kind of purchase, or at least give the go-ahead to Chinese firms before they to proceed to purchase those chips. And it has been quite a while since the Washington has sort of give the green light to NVIDIA to sell H200, but there are few purchases actually have been made. So perhaps the progress is that President Trump has persuaded the Chinese authorities to allow the Chinese firms to purchase these chips. And of course, as you mentioned, China probably in its own heart wants to lift all the export controls and get even more advanced chips. But also it has its own desire to never be chokehold in these kind of areas. So it's trying to develop its own industries and in this regard, and may not want to rely on American firms to supply these chips in the long term. So at least in the short term, perhaps, if the only thing that is achieved is the purchase of H200, perhaps it's not going to be a significant success. But as you mentioned, it might be just only part of the story, because there are, I think, signs, perhaps, there's going to be much more extensive lifting, like export control mechanisms. But that's still sort of to be confirmed. So we'll probably have to wait and see in terms of how the results are folding.
Sure. Andy, what's your expectation here?
Well, I think in the short term, it certainly could be win-win if NVIDIA can sell more chips, because we know that to accelerate this future of artificial general intelligence or widespread use of AI in society, the way China's approaching it, for manufacturing, humanoid robots, et cetera. The power to power the data centers is one constraint, but then computing power certainly is another. So I think that's certainly win-win. But if we look at it from a bit of a longer perspective, as Haolan touched upon, I think 2 points here. So one, I think it's widely recognized, unfortunately, that the U.S. because of its political structure, is agreement incapable. Because if you have a new presidential administration, you can see a complete reversal of previous agreements. But in particular, with President Trump, as we've seen, even within an administration, things can change overnight. So I think what this has shown is the prudence and the wisdom of the Chinese approach to, one, engage with every country around the world, but at the same time strengthen self-reliance in technology, in energy, and in food security as well. So we have to see, but I think short term it's good for everyone if NVIDIA, AMD, Cerebras perhaps that just IPO'd today can sell their chips in China. But I think from the Chinese perspective, it's not mutually exclusive. I think China's making important advances in everything from lithography to the chip production, downstream, et cetera. And that's only going to continue.
And another development that we've already seen is that U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was quoted by some American media as saying the two countries would establish a protocol for AI safety to keep non-state bad actors from exploiting the most powerful AI models. So, Joseph, who are those non-state bad actors? And like Andy just mentioned, how likely is meaningful China-U.S. cooperation on AI safety, like in the long run?
I think we don't yet have enough information to really judge what Bessent is talking about. And certainly when we think about who are the bad people in the world, they tend to be state actors. Yeah, of course, there are various hacking groups, but oftentimes the ones that are most capable are generally assumed to be working on behalf of one state or another. I would suggest that this is certainly something China has been trying to create. There's sort of a general AI security, AI regulation framework, not only with the United States, and the U.S. has consistently sort of rebuffed China in the past, but also with Europe to try to create global standards, regulations, and security. And so if this is something that the U.S. is now interested in moving forward with, and let's take it at face value, because again, we don't really know how committed the U.S. is to a lot of these things. And as was said, the U.S. does change course rather quickly, not just from one administration to the next, but from 1 week to the next. And of course, we have the midterms ahead of us. And there's been a lot of talk about him being sensitive to sort of the domestic political calendar. I'm not so sure that's the case. So as a result, I'm a little more inclined to believe that he is, given the people who came with him, he is interested in trying to find some sort of solution, because the various containment strategies have not only failed, they've backfired in ways that have really weakened the American position strategically and certainly weakened American companies, and done so precisely at a point when these companies are feeling greater vulnerability to the AI bubble in the United States, in contrast with China's incredible success in adopting AI in much more sustainable and less socially disruptive ways. So I think there is reason to believe that there is a strategic pivot taking place, and that would necessitate some sort of mechanism for ensuring that there could be a degree of AI cooperation and AI security between the two countries. And if that is the direction that we're headed in, then it will be really, really interesting to see the broader global implications, certainly given China's efforts to advance similar developments with the EU.
Right. Yeah, we'll explore further later on. But Andy, from a tech perspective, who do you think Bessent could refer to when he said some non-state bad actors, and your evaluation of the outlook of such a protocol or mechanism?
Well, I think the thing about artificial intelligence is that it lowers the barrier for all kinds of capabilities. So what this means is I agree that, historically only nation states could field certain kinds of capabilities, say, very sophisticated hacking, for example. But what AI has done is that it's empowered perhaps even individuals to engage in malicious activity that could have national, perhaps even global repercussions. So it seems to me that, one easy area for cooperation is information sharing about recognized threats. And this way it could be, if we needed a model or a reference point for this, like perhaps like Interpol, right, which is just countries, so not having their own law enforcement agents, but sharing a clearinghouse of information. Because the doomsday scenario that some people talk about is that AI already is or soon will be powerful enough to let individuals create tailored bioweapons. Now, of course, I think what some scientists say is that there's a huge gap between being able to design one on paper and to actually manufacture that. And that gap may be insurmountable. But if we think about this kind of black swan risk, even a very, very small probability of something very bad happening is probably worth taking some sort of measures against.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Before we explore further what Trump's China visit could mean for the future of bilateral tech ties and the global tech landscape, let's first take a broader look at the current state of Sino-U.S. tech relations. Haolan, are the two sides engaged in comprehensive competition with limited cooperation or selective cooperation amid broader rivalry? What would you say?
I would say probably it's still selective cooperations.
Right.
And the bottom line is that the many firms in Silicon Valley see China, I think, as the two professors pointed out before me, as a lucrative market that you cannot lose access to. And they deeply worry about the Chinese drive to sort of make sure that they do not have the bottleneck issues caused by U.S. export control, which has always been the sort of side effect or the drawback of export controls in terms of any industries, which the Silicon Valley has sort of warned against Washington, at least dating back to 2022 and 2023. So by the nature, we mentioned that NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang obviously is this sort of most important example, but before that Jensen Huang saga of going or not going, you see that Qualcomm CEO, another very important semiconductor manufacturer based in California, the CEO was traveling to China with the president, and they have tried to maintain a very strong relationship with China, even throughout the Biden administration. So we see that they still have that desire to cooperate. But then on the other hand, you have other, not only necessarily the manufacturing side, but the other side of the tech companies. You have leading AI companies in the US, Anthropic, and OpenAI has sort of taken a very hostile attitude toward China in terms of how the AI modeling development and also distilling and these kind of IP theft. Very curiously, that the Anthropic issued a statement about the danger of loosening export control. I think a research paper showing that they have sort of this strong opposition to helping China develop or gaining superiority in artificial intelligence race. So you probably say that it's going to be very interesting to see the divide between Silicon Valley as we see the emergence of this new tech forces and playing a significant role in American politics. Because I think in this year, we mentioned the midterms is obviously such a big calendar event, but also there are periphery political stuff happening on the ground, including many states level governments having discussion about perhaps having moratorium on AI development, AI modeling, but also on the infrastructures, including all the electricities and data centers that's going to driving the debate. And to respond to the kind of political question, there has been new emergence of the dark money groups and lobbying forces backed up by the so-called now big AI forces. And so they are going to show their fragmentation going forward. I think that's my expectations. And the Trump administration obviously has now taken a new approach, or even trying to find a new approach regarding export control and tech relationship with China. So we'll see how that from the macro level, then the micro level evolving, maybe in a very different directions, firm by firm and industry by industry base.
Indeed. Actually, before Trump took office, Silicon Valley was deeply intertwined with the Chinese market, right? Especially those chip makers. Companies like Apple, Qualcomm, or Intel relied heavily on Chinese market or manufacturing base, like you already mentioned. But now, especially those big AI companies, they seem to have a different opinion or attitude toward China. So what drove this? Some argue that, China's industry policies, such as Made in China 2025, alarmed Washington. How valid is that argument, Haolan?
I think there's sort of two-pronged, I think. The Chinese ambitions, including many of these manufacturing in 2020, 2025, and all these kind of other official rhetoric by Chinese government are taken seriously by Washington and also Silicon Valley and business industries. So there's obviously that. And then there's the ideology aspect, I think. But hiding behind the ideology aspect, I think it's probably the more real reason behind the anxiety by many of the AI firms in the US being such hostile toward China is that there is the question about how the cost, the astronomical cost about their models. And obviously most of the AI firms are yet to make money. I think that's probably much more in the case of OpenAI than Anthropic. I think Anthropic has been bragging about making even soon. We don't know how true that is, but the cost behind their model is quite significant, and they have to come up with at least, I think, something to explain to their investors about the why it's costing so much. And last year's DeepSeek moment in China was sort of very shocking to many industry people in the US, at least. Maybe just to show that it could be done in a much more cost-efficient way. Of course, you can debate whether they're events or not. There's sort of a technical aspect, which I'm not an expert to. But in sort of the macroeconomic level, we can see that it's in their interest to sort of play up the threats from China and the necessity of sort of having a basically regulation-free environment in the US to sort of make sure they could conduct in the way they had already been done, and also to make sure that they could keep their business going without actually facing a significant backlash from the market and their investors. So in order to get that help, get that favorable treatment by the market, by the US government, they have to play up the China threat. So I think that's a logical choice. Whether you can say that it's an ethical choice is another question in itself, but I think that's it's for a reason it exists because they find that useful for their business model.
Obviously, there are a lot of
I had something to the previous question.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah. In my research, one of the things that I look at is not just sort of technology in terms of the chip or the quantum computing ability or these sorts of things, but really how society altogether functions technologically, how it works together, how it brings its industrial capacities, its capacity to build infrastructure, to create effective supply chains, how it can address major problems, take advantage of key opportunities. And in all of these respects, China has become the world's leading technological society. In many cases, of course, its technology is either at the cutting edge or near the cutting edge, lagging in some, surpassing in others. But this is the key concern. And this is the thing that the US is really, I think, struggling with in terms of the very narrow concept of technology and the technology blockade that it has, in so much as the US is really not capable of functioning that way, is in complete disarray in terms of its capacities to solve problems at home and abroad. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it's important to understand that, if you go back to the 19th century, what really left China vulnerable to foreign aggression, whether it was the British in the 1840s or Japan later in the century, was precisely the technology gaps that China faced with these countries that were determined to be aggressive. And China has, from the beginning, since liberation, prioritized closing those technology gaps. And this is something that the United States has understood and increasingly understood was the key to it being ahead of China. But I think the thing that the U.S. has really struggled with, and I've seen this from a lot of scholars in Europe and certainly in the U.S., it's almost a mystification of technology, this idea that if we impose these sanctions or these tech blockades, there's no way China would be able to catch up. And although, producing chips is very, very technically advanced, and certainly forcing China to establish that capacity domestically was something that has posed a challenge, but not an insurmountable challenge for China. The key is China is able to develop and solve those problems precisely because it is a technological society. It is able to solve those type of technological problems. And so I think what we see is just a complete misunderstanding of the real problem between China and the United States and China's capacity to address the sort of problems that the U.S. continues to bring to China's doors. Now, if the U.S. has finally realized that, not only is China capable of engineering solutions, but also now U.S. markets are losing their monopolies and losing whatever leverage they had over China, then this is sort of the last moment in which the U.S. could try to reestablish that leverage and continue to have some degree of market share before losing it entirely.
That's what Washington is most concerned, right? It's fear that it will lose such kind of a leverage. But hopefully this trip will help them have a better understanding of how China works or how this world or the current situation works, probably, hopefully. This has been the Chat Lounge. When we come back, check out the implications of this trip, the future of Sino-U.S. tech relations, and the global technological order. Don't go away.
The strong wind was howling and whistling.
He was the first Chinese citizen to graduate from Yale University in the mid-19th century.
I was born on the 17th of November. She had prominent features. 3 of us were old enough to lend a helping hand.
He navigated between 2 vastly different cultures and moved further to realize his dream and promote understanding between the people of China and the United States.
Ye Mingxing was a native of Hanyang. I realized no danger. China is really awakening.
Come and join us in discovering the incredible journey of Haolan Wang in his autobiography, My Life in China and America. Check out the Audible stories on radio.cgtn.com and all major podcast platforms. Just search for the podcast Books and Beyond and find My Life in China and America.
Welcome back to the Chat Lounge. Let's continue our chat on the tech implications of U.S. President Donald Trump's China visit. Back to the current state of bilateral tech relations. To Andy, there are obviously a lot of areas for competition or maybe cooperation, which we will touch upon later on. But now focus on this major areas for competition. What lies at the heart of today's bilateral tech competition then? Is it semiconductors or AI or new energy and robotics or space technology or anything, you name it?
Well, I'd say it's all of the above, Yun, because, if you understand this from a geopolitical perspective, well, let me put it this way. If you accept this Mearsheimer view of the world, right, that at the nation state level, it's anarchy. There's no police department you can call if someone attacks you. So you have to maintain the capability to defend yourself. And countries do this based on their endowments, right? And the U.S. is very well endowed with a scientific infrastructure. What it is not well endowed with is the ability to sustain casualties, right? So we've seen this starting with the Vietnam War, when, the war was televised into the living rooms of Americans and they were, horrified, and that had a terrible political cost to Lyndon Johnson, who was the president at the time. So what the U.S., I think, took away from these experiences is that to maintain national security, it must be the dominant country technologically, whether we're talking about, again, precision munitions, electronic warfare, all of these high-tech things. So I think it naturally becomes alarmed when it sees any country, whether that was the Soviet Union or now China, closing the technology gap. And, to me, when we hear this term, which we hear less these days, of strategic mistrust, how do you reassure a country that your intentions are peaceful, right? And, this is perhaps a question that cannot be answered, but, that's the reason. And I think for better or worse, because China's rise economically and technologically is unstoppable, that the U.S. is going to have to come to terms that it is now in a world where it certainly does not have overwhelming technological dominance.
But do you think they will face this reality that, like you just said, China is unstoppable?
Well, I think they already have, right? And this visit by Trump, this most recent visit, I think is the prime example of that. Think about how Trump sees the world. I mean, it very much is, through a lens of power. So if I'm stronger than you, I can dictate to you. I can bully you. If you seem stronger than me, I hate to use this word, but it's kind of, there's a certain obsequious behavior, right? And again, we could see it very, very clearly. So I think that certainly Trump or the administration at its highest levels recognizes this. Now, surprisingly to me, in this second administration, there are still people that seem to be freelancing, taking very hawkish measures against China that isn't aligned with the top level strategy. And we saw this in the first administration in the reverse. Trump had these very grand ideas he wanted to implement, but, all of his top aides, cabinet officials were all old school Republicans who, did their best to restrain him. So, I think that this is where we are. And the U.S., I'm optimistic, frankly, that, the U.S. is coming to terms with this. It may take some time, but I think China is doing an excellent job of helping the U.S. come to terms with this new reality.
I think there are 6 or 7 members of the delegation are from the tech world. Do you think they can actually get what they want through this trip, or nothing significant or to their desire may happen this time? Or
Well, I think you have to be there. And I think especially with this administration, if you're not in the room where important conversations are happening or where important decisions are being made, you may be, the victim of these. So I think this is something that, these corporate CEOs, not just the tech CEOs, it's not just the Elon Musk and the Jensen Huangs, but again, look at the financial sector that was very well represented, right? There was Visa, Citi, et cetera. And again, I think that what they don't want to do is be thrown under the bus with a somewhat hard to predict administration.
Yeah, like Joseph just mentioned, there are some aspects that China is currently leading. Probably not leading, but at least, that can compete with the U.S., like space technology or AI, if you will. But
well, if I may,
sure.
I would say that we can look at it technology by technology to see who's ahead, and that's certainly one way to look at it. But I think that there really are only a couple of technologies that matter, and China is far, far ahead in this area. So I think when we look at every major technological shift in history, steam, electricity, even computing, we could say, it has its roots in energy. And when we look at where's the world going, China is sometimes referred to as the first electro state, right? It can produce enormous amounts of electricity. I think last year it was something like 10 trillion kilowatts of energy was produced and consumed, whereas the US, it was like 4 trillion kilowatts, so more than double. And why does that matter? Because you need electricity, obviously, for factories, for people to live their lives, but now for AI as well. So if you don't have enough electricity to power your chips in your data centers, there's no way you can play in this AI race, if we want to call it a race. So I think that, the technologies that really matter, China is unquestionably in the lead.
All right. Then, Haolan, what kind of cooperative projects, probably, do you expect from this trip then?
Oh, you mean cooperative?
Yeah, it's not just a competition, but cooperation.
For the tech industry or for
tech industry? Yes, that's what we're talking about now.
Right. Down the line,
specifically for the 7 members, tech members of the delegation, or if you can think of anything concrete here.
Well, besides selling their products and opening the Chinese market, they could also try to perhaps persuade the U.S. government. That's probably far-fetched. I don't think it's realistic, but in terms of infrastructure building, China has sort of a significant experience or capability of building electrical output. That's something that's certainly needed if it's going to for the U.S. to sort of maintain its strong leadership positions in the AI race, to have that sort of data centers and also electric outputs. They could theoretically borrow from China and perhaps getting sort of this in line with the Board of Investment and Board of Trade spirits that is being discussed in other areas to have the potential opportunity to cooperate, maybe investments and technology transfers on that front, but also helping build the infrastructure. But given the political environment, even if we have probably a very positive outcome of the summit between the two leaders, there's still significant structural barriers, not to mention all these logistical challenges, ideological challenges for that. But, in an ideal world, I guess infrastructure cooperation probably would be the best, except that's probably my my sort of hallucinations, but dream, I guess.
Sure. Joseph, your expectation?
My expectations for the outcome of the summit?
Yes. What kind of concrete results can they actually achieve?
Well, there is always a concern that this is kind of a media event. I think Trump understands that China has, as a rule, a commitment to engaging any country that sticks out its hand and says, "Okay, let's try to work together and solve problems." And China is generally a country that puts on a good face and welcomes and says, "Okay, let's do that," because this is a key value that China espouses. Certainly, I think it's been rather genuine. I think the historical visits we've seen in Beijing were, I didn't expect those. I think those are powerful images. There was a lot of work that was done to make sure this meeting could take place, including the meetings that were taking place in the last several days in Korea between the key economic negotiators. But they must have been working on things beforehand. Otherwise, it is a superficial engagement. And the point is, if Trump, comes here and makes a big show and nothing actually comes of it, he's the one who faces the bigger risk because he's the one who actually needs help. And he's the one who actually needs to show that he is a relevant world leader. And if he doesn't do that, then he further undercuts his own political brand and political power, and certainly risks losing whatever united front he is able to sustain with American business leaders, but also other American allies around the world, keeping in mind that those relationships are already deeply frayed. So he needs help. He needs something constructive to come out of this. Otherwise, he's going to be a lame duck much sooner than the midterms. So I think there's a compelling reason for them to actually come to real constructive outcomes. Again, we always have to be cautious because the U.S. has shown itself to be completely opportunistic and violently reactionary whenever it has served its own narrow interests. But let's put it this way. Trump needed this meeting more than China did. And I wouldn't say that Trump invited himself, but it sort of looked like that to a certain extent. And as a result, I think we can have a little more confidence that the U.S. side might be a little more reliable this time.
Yeah, but actually from the Chinese side, I think China also needs that too, especially when it comes to the technological relationship. I mean, those who believe that both countries need each other are already here, right? But those who, obviously, there are some others who strongly insist that the two countries or the U.S. should decouple from China, especially when it comes to tech competition.
I would say, let me just interject and say, I don't think China needs the United States as much as the United States needs China. If you look at the record investment that China is now moving into Brazil, if you look at the way China has the ability to source food from Brazil, the way that China is able to balance and calibrate its relationship with Brazil, whether the right wing or the left wing is in power, this shows an adeptness and an ability to move around, to break out and to move across the world in ways that the U.S. is unable to contain. The only reason I would submit that China needs to find a solution to the relationship with the U.S. is because if the U.S. is going to really collapse at a faster rate of speed, this creates greater chaos in the world. And China would like to avoid that chaos. China isn't interested in seeing the dollar collapse tomorrow. China isn't interested in seeing broad political chaos in the United States. China would like to avoid those types of situations for two reasons. One, because just broadly that creates the sort of problems that Beijing always hates. But secondly, there is a concern that if the United States is truly in a position of collapse, it might choose to do something even more rash. It might choose to go to war. It may choose to leverage its last little bit of strength in terms of its military superiority to try to change an outcome that it is desperate to avoid. So, this is, I think, the true driving force in China's thinking today is that, okay, it's part of our philosophy. We like to work with people. We want to work with people. We would rather work with people than struggle with them. But at the same time, we don't need the U.S., but we do need to avoid things spiraling out of control. So the extent to which we can cooperate with each other at this point would be good. But let's be clear. When the U.S. first started these tech blockades a few years ago, there was panic in China. There was concern that China might not be able to find solutions, that there was concern that China might be in some way vulnerable to the U.S. But now that we have seen the AI breakthroughs and even the new Huawei chip breakthroughs, there's a lot more confidence here, a lot more certainty that China can go it alone if it has to. It doesn't have to depend on the U.S. or U.S. tech. So this is, I think, a major change and a shift in confidence that has had tremendous impacts on China's strategic thinking vis-a-vis the U.S.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Haolan, do you agree that actually the U.S. needs China more than China needs the U.S.? And if nothing essential comes out of this meeting, would it reinforce the impression or the attitude back in Washington that the U.S. can decouple from China in terms of a technology relationship?
Oh, I certainly agree that, yes, the U.S. probably hasn't realized before the blockades, even the trade war last year, that it has sort of the dependency problem with China. Well, that's obviously a good thing for the bilateral relationship whenever the question of decouple come up, as you mentioned. When they both sides realized it could not depart from each other without relying on each other's strengths and also the markets and resources, is much more beneficial to sort of get this managed stability or managed competition, as we had been discussed. Of course, the two presidents has proposed in this sort of maybe entering U.S.-China relationship into this new phase, and so it's not a bad idea for the U.S. side to realize that, and I think it's very quite clear from the Trump administration point, which we discussed earlier. It's quite different tone when it came in 2017, and also quite different tone when he talked about China in the beginning of the second administration last year. And that sort of signaling a shift and recognition, which is a good thing. It was just perhaps the drawback and failure or impartial success succeed of the containment strategies. But in terms of how the tangible outcomes, I think a broad framework for agreements and including other side deals will be quite good enough for this summit, because as President Trump has mentioned already, that he invites President Xi to visit U.S. in September, probably to attend the UN General Assembly as well. And that is potentially only the second meeting of the year, with the G20 and APEC coming up in U.S. and China respectively. And if we can accomplish everything, then how much could the two leaders deliver at the end of the year? And if we now kickstart this process of actual negotiations of structural agreements and basically put it in place maybe for the next couple of years, and it's quite clear that China seeks not only stabilization, but sort of at least a short long term in terms of maybe the next 2.5 years of Trump administration, about the boundaries and the sort of the framework how the U.S. and China can move forward. And I think we'll probably see that much more come to fruition in September, in December, and November later this year.
All right. Andy, how would you predict the trajectory of a bilateral tech relationship after Trump's China visit this time?
Well, I think first of all, we never know, because again, we can see these overnight pivots. But I think the structural forces at work here point towards a better relationship. And again, because I think once the U.S. recognizes that it cannot maintain its technological lead, and it comes to terms with that, the rational thing to do is to work with China. And there are enormous complementarities. So if we look at whether we're talking about OpenAI, Anthropic, Facebook, Google, Alphabet, whatever, et cetera, so many of their top technical talents are from China. So, I think that, this has been, I think, very unfortunate that with the very negative political climate, that has hurt people-to-people exchanges, including American students coming to China and Chinese students going to the United States. So, again, I think from a structural perspective, all of the structural forces point towards greater cooperation. And in a way, I think these China hawks are trying to fight the inevitable.
Right. So you don't expect that those China hawks to actually successfully reverse this trend, or there couldn't be any further escalation there?
Well, let me use the stock market as an example.
All right.
The stock market will always have ups and downs, but the the longer term trend, if we look at, say, the S&P 500, right, is always up. But that does not mean that there are not, corrections, consolidations in the short term. But the trend is pretty clear.
Okay. Joseph, your prediction or expectation?
My expectation in terms of outcomes from the summit.
Yeah, and the outlook of bilateral tech relations, is it like the beginning of a thaw or just a temporary pause before further escalation?
I think that we almost have to be schizophrenic when we think about this relationship. We really have to, because again, the way the U.S. changes course, you have to sort of constantly, play out the scenario in terms of, okay, are we going to move towards conflict, a direct kinetic conflict? And to be clear, the U.S. was positioning. We saw this in rhetoric and congressional testimony from military leaders that there was some positioning, fear mongering of a possible conflict with China next year. That there would be attacks by China against others, maybe the mainland attacking Taiwan or something, or that China was mounting these capacities, and that the U.S. needed to be prepared to go to war. And maybe that was driving record defense budgets. Or maybe when Trump renamed the Department of Defense the Department of War and attacked Venezuela and Iran, and we saw these as energy denial strategies ahead of a possible kinetic conflict with China, which is what you would do. This is what the U.S. did to Japan ahead of World War II. You try to limit an adversary's access to energy. My point is, I think all of these tactics by the U.S., from the trade war, from a possible energy denial strategy to the tech blockade, they've all failed. And we could see, and above all, China still has control over 90% of the world's rare earths, so which the U.S. absolutely needs. Now, it could be the U.S. is trying to buy time, and so we're looking at just a way for them to continue to deal with each other in a constructive way, but we're going to have a little bit of some breathing space to get us past the midterms or whatever comes next. I don't think the risk for war is as strong as it might have been a couple of months ago, but I would still be cautious about that. I don't think we've really reached a breakthrough point where we're all going to be happy, peaceful, and loving each other once again, but I don't foreclose that as a possibility.
All right. And the last question, zooming out, how will this China-U.S. competition and cooperation, or this trip, or the outcome of Trump's China visit, reshape the global technology landscape? Could the rivalry divide the global technology system into competing blocks? I think Haolan mentioned that there will be some fractures within the two countries. But what about globally, Haolan?
Well, I'm no expert on the EU, but I think the U.S. and China certainly is being proven by the last decade or so to be the leaders of technologies. In addition to the leadership on all the other front, basically.
Right.
So as the world perhaps heading toward this bipolar structure, many other actors are sort of watching this closely, including potentially many in Europe, and also many in India and Japan and Southeast Asia, these new emerging powers, and perhaps in the Middle East. They could, of course, take the positive sign from China, including the U.S. trying to get a commitment from China to sort of make sure it is going to ensure the outflow of rare earth materials to not only just the U.S. but to the world. I'm sure the EU, hearing this, is quite delighted if that is true, the outcome of the summit. But it also could have realized that they're not at a table. Of course, this is a bilateral meeting. You're not expected to have the third-party actors. But in terms of if the U.S. and China getting out this new framework of trying to ensure AI dominance, AI governance, and also leading in EVs and all the other areas, you probably see these countries and regions, to be specific, are going to have sort of anxiety going on. Maybe they come to China. They already, many other states have already come to China to seek potential cooperations and also hedging against what they say are increasing iron liability of the U.S. Even for states like Canada, historically joined at the hips with the U.S., are sort of developing its own China and Asia strategy. So we'll probably see this new fragmentation coming, perhaps with U.S. China taking this leading role and being its own sort of self and polars, but also with other state actors maybe trying to carve out their own paths or even trying to join the U.S. China on this ride. But we have to see about how that evolves. and depends on how much results actually achieved from this meeting, but also from the this year. As President Xi has said, this is going to be very consequential, perhaps charting a entirely new chapter between U.S.-China relationships. And by extension, I think at this moment of days and age, new charter territory for U.S.-China relation probably means an emerging new world order as well. But that might be a little exaggeration, but I think that's sort of perhaps where things are heading.
Thanks. And Joseph, how are regions like Europe, Southeast Asia, or the Middle East positioning themselves amid growing pressure to choose sides, maybe?
Well, maybe this. I think there are different ways of looking at it. On the one hand, I think the U.S. strategy failed in the Middle East and has created a huge mess, not only for the U.S. but its allies. And I think that these countries will be looking to China to help resolve this, to emerge from this morass. And they will certainly see President Xi standing shoulder to shoulder with Trump and perhaps offering some sort of constructive way to resolve some of these differences that have led to some of these conflicts in various ways. I think that you have to look at a country like Germany, which is facing severe risk of deindustrialization, now having survived being cut off from Russian energy, now not having really the resources to withstand the new energy shocks, while also facing additional security pressures from the U.S. with withdrawing troops, while Germany's trying to also finance its own military buildup, while facing political insurgency in terms of the U.S. trying to instigate right-wing politics there. Meanwhile, Japan, sailing through the Taiwan Strait as the towing behind American warships, being pushed into militarization and undermining their positive relationship with China. Japan is being hammered by the situation in the Strait of Hormuz, much more so than China is. Japan faces much greater risks than China does. So I think a lot of countries will be watching what's happening with Trump and President Xi and coming to the conclusion that whatever you do, you shouldn't be on the wrong side of China. You may still have to be careful and walk a very cautious line with the United States. If even the U.S. has to come to China and seek help, then why are you out there trying to take a very different approach and move contrary to a more inclusive and more equitable multilateral system?
Hopefully that'll happen. And lastly, Andy, help us wrap this whole thing up. Thank you.
Let's look at what President Xi outlined, which he called for, or I guess inaugurated a new chapter in China-U.S. relations of constructive strategic stability. And I think the point that's really relevant here when we talk about technology is healthy stability with competition within proper limits. And here, I think whether we're talking about domestic competition, as we've seen in China, or international competition, that competition within proper limits really is, I think, a good way to achieve breakthroughs and to spread the benefits of technology. So, again, if the U.S. continues what seems to be a very conciliatory path, at least, this is the rhetoric and the optics, and we have to see how, things play out after that. But then, certainly I think it's a very good thing for China and the U.S. And I want to say here, too, that while geopolitically we are in a multipolar world, I think technologically it is a bipolar world, because it really is just China and the United States that have the critical mass of both markets and talent to really push the technology envelope.
With that, we conclude our chat for this session. Many thanks to Professor Andy Mok of Beijing Foreign Studies University, Professor Josef Mahoney from East China Normal University, and Dr. Haolan Wang from the Asia Society Policy Institute Center for China Analysis for your time and insights. We'd love to know what you think. Drop us a line at radio@cgtn.com. I'm Tu Yun, saying thank you for listening. Join us for more chat at the Chat Lounge next week. Talk soon.
I was born on the 17th of November.
Delve into a world of words with Books and Beyond, a podcast made especially for audiobook lovers.
I came into the
world as the youngest of 5
I
children.
wondered what Her Majesty would be like.
Fie upon you, limpid one. Why have you taken...
Immerse yourself in gripping stories and timeless classics from the comfort of your own personal space.
Sun Tzu underlined 3 points on the context to gain
There was
initiative.
no better wine, and not to mention the...
Whether you're a bookworm or a casual listener, our carefully curated selection of audiobooks will transport you to new worlds and stir your imagination. Subscribe to Books and Beyond and start your audiobook adventure now on radio.cgtn.com or your favorite podcast app.